Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Unpacking Possibility. I'm your host, Traci Stein, and I'm super, super excited to introduce you to Dr. Helané Wahbeh, who is an incredibly talented and interesting person. Among other things, she's the director of research at IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. She's a naturopathic physician who is well-trained in research and has received grants to study some exceptionally interesting and somewhat esoteric phenomena, in addition to studying things that you've all heard about, like post-traumatic stress disorder and mindfulness and so forth. I'm going to let her introduce herself because she'll do a much better job. But Helané, welcome. I'm super happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, Traci. It's wonderful to be here with you talking about this incredible work that we've been doing around channeling and how it can really support people in their daily lives.
Now, you have a new book out, The Science of Channeling, which from what I've read so far is fantastic. It's interesting. And I don't think I've ever read anything like that. So I'm wondering if you want to give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and to your book and to your work, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sounds great. So when I was a young child, I was incredibly sensitive and I could feel people's energies around me. And, you know, I was kind of afraid of the dark and felt like there were things in the dark that I couldn't see but could feel. And as I grew older, still a child though, my mother took me to my grandparents' house to what they call meetings. And at these meetings, my uncle would go into a trance and would do something called trance channeling. And my mother can do this, my grandmother can do this. My grandfather has researched or did research it when he was around for his whole life. My whole mother's side of the family has these intuitive abilities that they've used. And I had this introduction to it at 10 years old. And it was an incredibly important part of my personal life. In parallel was my academic career, my clinical training. So I was very interested in healing, in mind-body medicine, how the way we think influences our health. I ended up getting a clinical degree in naturopathic medicine, was in private practice for a while, and then got back into clinical research, specifically mind-body medicine and mindfulness meditation. And you referenced my large National Institute of Health funded study on combat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. We found some incredible things through that. And that was at Oregon Health and Science University, which is, you know, an academic medical university, medical school. So those two paths were very isolated and separate from each other. And I couldn't bring to my lab meetings at OHSU my intuitive experiences of doing the diagnostic interviews with these combat vets about what I was seeing, what I was feeling. That wasn't something that was appropriate to do. And, you know, when I first started that research, meditation research was still incredibly new, and it was very focused about the research questions that we were actually allowed to ask. We could say, what's happening in the brain or what's happening on the skin, but we couldn't really get into, you know, more spiritual or transcendent experiences that was happening during meditation. So I have this deep personal experience and this rich research background. I was invited by IONS to go to this Future of Meditation work group with a number of researchers. And I had some exposure to IONS, but not a lot. I got to this event and I was completely blown away that they were actually asking these research questions about more esoteric concepts, about our intuition and the various forms of that. And so we published a paper on that that's now publicly available about how do we bring those elements that are missing to meditation research. And that really inspired me to connect with the IONS team to say, hey, I want to do this. I want to be able to study these things that I haven't been able to study in the past. So now, I became consultant and employee and director of research. And so now I get to apply these rigorous scientific methods to what I'm calling channeling. And so I want to define that for you, if that's okay, because I think the context is really important. So the way I define channeling is a little unique, but it's this process of revealing information and energy from beyond our conventional notions of time and space. And the way that shows up for people can be receptive or it can be expressive. And, my personal belief and the premise we have at IONS is that everyone has the capacity to channel in some way, but that the way it shows up for them is unique to them. And these experiences exist on a spectrum from gut hunches or intuition that probably all your listeners could say that they've experienced at some point in your life.
Absolutely.
To more rare things like mediumship and trance channeling, and then things in between, like mind-to-mind communication, or knowing the future through a dream and things like that. So my channeling term is an umbrella term that really holds these different intuitive experiences that people have. So that's a little bit of background. So why I was so motivated to write this book. First, it's based on a research program we're doing at IONS, which is really focused on the science. And yet every time I started talking about the studies that we were doing, I would get so many people coming up to me saying, or emailing me saying, I had this experience. I can't talk to anybody about it. They're going to think I'm crazy. I feel, really uncomfortable. Thank you so much for sharing what you're doing and showing me that I'm actually not alone. And that really inspired me to try to get the word out in a more general public kind of way than from a specifically scientific way. And, of course, synchronistically, I ended up connecting with one of the founders of New Harbinger Publications at one of our IONS events, where I did a presentation on the research program. And he said, you should write a book about that. I said, I don't know. And he, encouraged me. And here we are 2 years later with the book just being released this month.
Well, first of all, congratulations on the book again. There's so many things I really like about what I've read so far. And I think anyone listening will as well. One of them is that you have found this artful balance between talking about channeling in a way that anyone can identify what it is, and identify experiences that many, if not most people have had. The other thing I really like that you do is you talk about the research in a way that does not require you to be a researcher to understand it.
Right.
And another thing I think was really intriguing about the book is, and as someone who is, done my own kind of personal intuitive development, but certainly is not a professional intuitive, I was reading your book and I hadn't thought about those experiences like telepathy, like mediumship, where it doesn't feel like the information is channeled so much as observed, telepathic communication, even psychotherapy, which I think is much more common than people realize. And there was something else, psychic dreams, prophetic dreams, intuitive dreams. There's so much more, but you talk about these as types of channeling. And that's very different, I think, than the common conception of channeling as being taken over by something else, where you're kind of like knocked out of the way fully. Right. So can you talk a little bit about that, just so people understand what you mean when you're saying that, everyday experiences that people could recognize?
Yes. So, channeling, as I'm using as an umbrella term, includes something that's on this right side of the spectrum, which is sometimes called trance channeling, or a form of mediumship. There's a lot, possession has been used in some more anthropological studies. So there's a lot of different words that describe what you just alluded to, which is this experience where the channeler feels like they're either stepping aside or going unconscious, and another supposed being is actually using their body as a vehicle to communicate. So that's what maybe in the West, when people hear channeling, that's what they think of. And so I actually had concerns about calling the book Science of Channeling and continuing to use that term. And I used my own kind of internal guidance about whether I should stick with that. And I also talked to the publisher and they said, no, stick to channeling. And when you think about this word channel, it really is about, moving something through you, but also being part of something bigger than yourself. And, when we think about this noetic wisdom, this inner knowingness, aligned with what we're learning from quantum physics and cosmology and all these different other avenues about how we're all interconnected and part of this greater whole, that my body, my awareness, bringing that out or taking pieces from it still feels like channeling to me, regardless of what it looks like. So I appreciate you asking that question, though, because there's so much confusion about terms, psi, psychic, ESP. There's, I have this 300-page book of terms in parapsychology, which is the field of psychology that studies these types of experiences. So I'm glad that we were able to clarify that for the listeners.
I think it's so important. And I agree with you. I think channeling can evoke, I'm thinking of like the late 19th century mediums and ectoplasm. And not that isn't a type of channeling, it is, right, but it's not one most people can recognize as channeling as it happens, according to your definition, in everyday life.
That's right.
Even just, you talk about even telephone channeling the information of who is going to call. And that I think was so much more common before we had caller ID and so forth, but it's one almost anyone can relate to. And I like that.
Yeah, we're actually getting ready to start a study on that probably in the next month around telephone telepathy based on Rupert Sheldrake's work, who did so many experiments on that. And we're replicating his work and adding a little twist where we're asking people to sign up in a group of 3, and they tell us how they're related. So it has to be family members. And so let's say, your phone's in the other room, you can't see your caller ID, and it's like, oh, that's mom. And you go look, and it's actually mom. Does it happen more often with mom that that she's calling, or does it happen with your friends too? So does it matter how genetically close you are to the person and how sort of connection close you are to the person, like your best friend versus an acquaintance? So you're right. Everyday experiences can be thought of as channeling. And, these happen spontaneously. And there's a whole group of phenomenon that just happen spontaneously. And then there are some that happen intentfully, where people actually, consciously go into some altered state, usually of consciousness, to be able to tune in to information that they might not normally know through their traditional 5 senses. And then, of course, we have all the lab experiments that we can do in the lab, which are intentful and very highly structured.
There's so much in what you just said, so I might pop around a little bit. Going back a moment ago, you mentioned him in your book. Rupert Sheldrake, for people who don't know, is a well-known British biologist who really went out on a limb and changed the course of his career in life in a good way, I think, by talking about animals, dogs that know when their owners are coming home, one of his books. But that's not something we would think about as channeling necessarily. And yet it is an incredibly common experience. And it's bi-directional for animals to know what we are thinking or when we are arriving before it's discernible through any other normal sense. And for us to know what they are thinking or what is going on with them. So I think a lot of people will be able to relate to that, the pet lovers, and I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Yeah.
Big pet lover. And then there was something else you mentioned. It'll come back to me. I'm just looking at my questions for you, but the research. I think it's so important that you're talking about the research because, you know, I'm not unfamiliar with research on psychic phenomena, and yet I would not have thought there's at least 40 years of good research on channeling specifically. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that. What's important for people to know about what we know about who channels, what facilitates that, is this trainable, and so forth?
Right. So I can go back to my story a little bit about this. So, you know, I had this personal experience that was a very big part of my life. And I, you know, used those channeling tools in my life to support me. And then I had this, you know, intense research background. And I never thought that I could actually apply that to these channeling phenomenon. And when I started at IONS, I learned about this field called parapsychology. And I was completely blown away to learn that there's actually been 150 years of formal, rigorous study into these types of phenomenon. And more recently, I guess it's not so recent anymore, in the last 60 years, with very rigorous experiments being done in the lab. So, you know, through controlled experiments and having controls, etc. And so that was so incredible to me that these subjective, personal experiences that I was having were actually being studied by scientists, being replicated in the lab, you know, growing evidence now that these are real phenomenon and we can observe them objectively. Despite that 150 years, it still feels like a very early and exploratory field. There hasn't been a lot of funding to support the research. And so while we've gathered enough research now to do syntheses, like through systematic reviews and meta-analyses, there's still so many aspects to these phenomenon that we have yet to learn about. So for me, again, going back to this person who's coming to me after the talks, you know, and supporting them to be able to stand in their power and say, this is actually a real thing. It's not just me. So many other people have experienced this in many cultures around the world. And look, there's actually studies that have talked about it in all these different ways to try to explore how it works, what are the parameters, who can do it, etc. And so the literature is vast, right? So if you wanted to start probing the 150 years of studies, it's incredibly overwhelming. And I can't say that I've actually been able to do that very thoroughly. But for the book, I wanted to give a very high level resource, if you will, for the various areas of research that do exist about it and highlighting the major studies in the different arenas. So I hope that the readers will just see it as that resource guide and this confidence builder to come out of the channeling closet and start having conversations about it so we can learn more about how it can support us in our lives, but also build up a much broader research around it so we can learn more.
one of the many things you have learned in your own work and in your review of the existing research is just how common these experiences are. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, because it's probably more common than a lot of people realize.
Yes, absolutely. I have a whole chapter of that in the book. I think a good way to be able to share about this is to talk about one of the studies we did. We did a survey. It was almost 900 people, and they were split into 3 groups. One was scientists and engineers. The other was people from the general population. And the other was people on the IONS listserv. So we called them enthusiasts because they're completely into this stuff. So we asked these people about 27 different channeling experiences and said, hey, have you ever had this? And if so,
can you
how
describe
often?
some of them? Can you list some of those experiences that you asked about?
Sure. So one of the main questions that's actually been asked globally is about contact with the dead. Another was mind-to-mind communication, as people call that telepathy. Another was about being able to see at a distance. So some people might call that clairvoyance or remote viewing. And then more, common experiences like just knowing information that you wouldn't normally know. That's sometimes called claircognizance. And then clairempathy, which is like feeling other people's emotions. And this is a little different than, normal empathy, in that, you see someone crying and you obviously know they're feeling sadness and you might feel some sadness for their sadness. But this is a little different in that you're actually feeling people's emotions without that traditional 5 senses feedback, if you will. So those are some of the items that we asked them about. We didn't say anything about this is a survey on channeling or psi or anything like that. We tried to keep it as neutral languaged as possible. And what was amazing is that we found over 90% of the people in those 3 groups had endorsed at least one of those items. And that number just completely blew me away. So I said, there's got to be something wrong here. So I looked at our items again, and we did another analysis where we took out, I think it was 4 or 5 items, like the clairempathy one, or that might be, maybe they just misread it and thought it was normal empathy or something like that. And it was still above 80%. And the scientists and engineers were very close to the other 2 groups. That also surprised us because of such strong taboos in research and the world in general, that we thought that they wouldn't have had those experiences. But according to that survey, they have, and they're not talking about it or studying it. Also,
we're not calling it, we're not calling it what it is.
Right. And also to mention, there have been so many studies by different researchers all around the world looking at these various phenomenon. And we call it the prevalence, the percent of people who endorse it range from like 10% all the way up to, the 90s, like we shared in Japan and Iceland and Europe, huge studies with tens of thousands of people. So I think I say in the book, if you're, in a group of 10 people, imagine 8 to 9 of them have had some sort of experience like this at least one time.
What I love that you do in the book also is I think you help put this in perspective by talking about, if we were talking about the prevalence of an illness, a common cold or something, and we would talk about it and describe it as common, we would only really be talking about 1% of the population, 1 in 100 people.
Right.
And what you found is that the prevalence of these if we call it channeling experiences or intuitive or psychic or however people want to think about them, whatever term is comfortable for them, is 10 times that at
That's
least.
right.
And depending on, like you said, an enthusiast in the population of enthusiasts, people who are really interested in this, maybe they've trained a lot, they, belong to professional associations that are studying what you're studying, where that is a big feature. And it's going to be higher in those groups than in somebody who's never given this a thought, usually. But you also mentioned, and I think this really is going to be something that our listeners can relate to, that there are things we do that make us more likely to have these experiences. So I'm wondering if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So the strongest predictor that we have control over, if you will, is meditation. And, this is very interesting to me, just being a meditation researcher, but being able to quiet the mind and get into that still state allows people to perform better on these type of tasks in the library. When people are surveyed in terms of having channeling experiences, meditators have them more. And also meditators, when they get into their practice, we did another study where we surveyed them and asked, have you had any of these experiences? Also develop having these channeling experiences more. And it's interesting, depending on the tradition, some spiritual teachers actually tell their students to ignore it, that it's a distraction from their spiritual path, and to not go there, because that could be driven by the ego to, oh, I can read minds, or, oh, I can do this. And yet in these ancient traditions, it's a known outcome that when you begin, a very deep spiritual meditative practice, that you will start having these experiences.
So if you want to start having more experiences of channeling, meditate. Meditation's wonderful for you anyway. You also talked about belief.
Yes.
And I don't know if we think about it as openness to experience, like openness to the possibility that something is real.
That's true. Belief in it is also a very strong predictor in laboratory studies and also just out in the world. So it's funny because I've talked to a number of different teachers who believe that they can teach anyone different types of channeling skills, like mind over matter, psychokinesis, or remote viewing, or clairvoyance, it's called, being able to see something at a distance, energy healing, medical intuitive capacities, and even trance channeling. So I've talked to a number of different teachers who say, if the person believes, I can teach them. And we've been very interested in what makes a channeler, and have done a variety of different studies around that. And just because a teacher can teach anyone if they believe, it may take some people longer to learn remote viewing than the person next to them, but that both of them could actually learn. And we're trying to understand the different nuances of that. One common piece is around heredity, and that this runs in families. So,
I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, it runs in my family. So it's like, okay, there's got to be some genetic component here. And, there have been only a few studies looking at that formally. So we just finished a study looking at high functioning psychics and controls, and found a really unique difference between them in their genes. And actually in the psychics, all of them had the original form of this one part of the DNA called the non-coding DNA. They used to call it junk, but it's not really junk DNA. And And so it's the original form. And so the people who said they couldn't channel or didn't have family members who channel had a mutated form and
a newer version.
A newer version, and that newer version in the larger population is related to the spread of Christianity and the increase in technology. So I found that incredibly fascinating. So perhaps there's some genetic piece that is the basis of our, what we're calling noetic signature, or kind of your unique way of channeling, that your unique way is informed by your physiology, but also how you were raised, and also being that you can be trained. So that's a really exciting research avenue that we're moving forward on to explore that more fully.
I love that. And I love that you're talking about that. I'm just having an association as you were talking about, I'm going to say older DNA. That would be correct. Okay. I'm just thinking, before all of our technology, our survival, I think, would be enhanced by our ability to detect things before they are detectable by our more mundane senses, normal smell, hearing, vision, and so forth. So it kind of makes sense to me that people with that vestige or that earlier DNA would naturally be more able to do that. Not that that would be the only mechanism necessarily, right? Because I think you mentioned in your book, if somebody asked, let me ask you, if we were to ask, how does this work? The overall answer would be,
we don't really know. We don't know exactly how it works. We have some hints, and I think how it works may be different for the different types of channeling. And so one thing I want to talk about here, which I think is really important, is this concept of consciousness and what our consciousness actually is. So if you talk to a neuroscientist, they're going to talk about being awake, being aware, being able to see what's around you. And so I'm calling that little c consciousness, okay? That I'm sitting here connecting with you, I'm awake, I'm conscious. What we're really interested in channeling is big C consciousness. And that goes beyond our awake sense. And there's a number of physicists and other scientists who are putting forth theories that this big C consciousness is actually the foundation of our reality, that it's like the most basic level of our existence, which is quite incredible. And so I think we feel a dissonance in our Western world, especially around these topics, and we face so many taboos because our current paradigm is materialist. Our consciousness in that paradigm is very stuck in our physical brain. Our brain creates it, and when our body dies, it goes with it, that it's this material thing. And so what we're learning from so many different avenues, including channeling research, is that our consciousness isn't limited to our physical brain. It's actually what we call non-local. It transcends time, it transcends space. And when you look at the world from that lens, that our consciousness is non-local and can, travel instantaneously halfway across the world, then these phenomena don't seem that strange anymore. And so numerous experiments have shown us that channeling likely doesn't work by force. So it's not a laser beam that shoots out of my eyes and travels to you, in New York or whatever, that it's likely happening in some informational or quantum way that we're just beginning to learn about.
And when you say non-local, not limited by space or time, you mean that it's, and this is what I've heard from other people like Russell Targ and other people who've been doing this for a really long time, is that it is as easy to gather information about something that happened 100 years ago as it is to gather information about something that's happening right now, and to gather information that is about something that has not yet happened, although there seems to be a little more variability on that end. But for all intents and purposes, we just, our consciousness, our big C consciousness is not limited in the way we have been trained to think of it as being.
Absolutely. There's a great experiment that I think will help elucidate this. So imagine two people sitting on completely separate sides of a building in enclosed rooms. And one person's the sender and the other person's the receiver. So the receiver is hooked up to EEG and EKG and all these different physio equipment, and the sender is also, they're both hooked up to the same, and those are synchronized. The sender sees that person's image on a screen at certain intervals and is directed to send their intention to them, positive intention. And so they do that over and over again. And we've repeated this many times. And many other researchers have looked at this. They look at the physiology, and the physiology of the receiver changes when the intention is being sent instantaneously. So it's not like the person's intention had to travel from one side of the building to the other side of the building. It instantaneously shifts. So that's remarkable. And we have examples of this in so many different protocols, like the Global Consciousness Project with random number generators and this instantaneous effect. And you mentioned Russell Targ and remote viewing and being able to, see military bases halfway across the world during the Stargate military study.
Including secret things that
That's right.
you couldn't even validate their viewing till much later in some cases.
Yeah, and that brings up a really important point, because I feel like the work around this is going to exponentially increase once we start seeing practical applications of it. And on the flip side, I think that also brings up fear for people, because, if you can read my mind, that completely scare, like, I don't want people to read my mind. I don't want people to know my innermost thoughts. And yet, my personal experience and the people I've connected with, it doesn't work that simply. And so there is little to fear at this point.
Or that clearly for most people. There's probably a handful of people, or maybe, I don't know, a few dozen, I don't know, but who are that incredibly skilled. Right. For most of us, even with training, first, I mean, as a psychologist, I'm thinking, first of all, hopefully people have better boundaries than to be snooping in people's windows or minds right. without being invited to. Right. But also it's not, because I think sometimes one of the criticisms of psychic phenomena and psychic research is that, well, it's not, the information isn't perceived in a 100% accurate way almost ever. Mm-hmm. But nor is it when people have a regular conversation. There are bits right. of information that are interpreted or lost. And I think it's important for people to keep that in mind.
Right. Right. Another interesting piece around that is working in groups. So I know that they do this in remote viewing, and some trans channelers I've connected with have been working more in groups to kind of like by consensus come up with the information, and that acts as a better control. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's so true and so interesting. I want to be mindful of your time. So I have two questions that I want to make sure that I ask you. One is, how do you see a benefit to the average person of learning to develop these skills further? And the second question is some things they can do in addition to meditation that may facilitate that learning.
Great. I think this is so essential for our world right now. So we live in an incredibly challenged place right now. Our humanity is incredibly challenged in so many different ways. And because of technology, especially in the West, we're so externally focused on how to get information about, what we're going to do with our day or our job or etc. Just these daily decisions are informed so strongly by the external stories that we're hearing from social media, etc. And so I feel that using channeling and our intuitive capacity to go more inward to our inner noetic wisdom will really support us to first just be happier and reduce suffering. And we've seen this in so many of our surveys that when people channel, they have positive impact, greater quality of being, etc. That they'll just feel better internally, and that on a practical level, it's going to inform people's lives so that their lives are more easeful. And, one of the strongest things people use channeling for is for decision making and to actually support them in making decisions in their lives. So how many people do you know who are like, can't, figure out what to do with themselves, or do I pick this thing or that thing, or this, do I live here or there, or this choice, that choice? And, being able to tune in to your intuition makes those decisions so much easier. So I think I know that was kind of a long-winded answer, but
no, it was perfect.
It's a very simple answer, which is to actually help us practically in our daily lives to be healthier, happier, clear, stop banging our heads against the wall, and being able to just choose what is in our highest and best in each moment, which then ripples out because it affects the families, it affects the communities. And what if we even actually could use this to solve some of the really intense, horrible problems we're facing right now?
And I, just to piggyback on what you just said, when you were talking about clear empathy before, I never actually heard the term used that way. And I think of empathy and, empathy that is more psychic in nature. And I'm glad to know the term because I think it's so helpful. My assumption from what you said is also that with greater ability to tap into information beyond ourselves and maybe of a higher kind of, from a higher kind of more spiritual source, can we become more empathic in general and more clear, have greater clear empathy for others, even those we don't know, right. in a way that shapes our behavior and our attitudes for the better, right. Hopefully.
Absolutely, because I don't know anyone who is on this sort of channeling path, if you will, that doesn't feel more connected to others. And, if we let go of this totally false perception that we are separate and that my actions don't affect the next person, and we move into this place of interconnectedness, it often just fosters more compassion and love and kindness for ourselves first, but then also for the people around us. And I think it allows us to honor diversity and the uniqueness of everybody more easily. You see, so much of what is causing suffering in our world today is from this false belief that we're actually separate, and the whole concept of othering, this other, us, them, etc., etc. We could have a whole nother week, this long discussion about that. So I think that's the most practical use, is to really go within, tune into our own inner wisdom. And not that it's not important to know what's going on in the world, but to choose the own story that we want to inform our choices. And in terms of practice, so yes, meditation, absolutely number one.
Number one.
Number two is belief. Do you believe this? And if not, what would support you to believe that this actually would work for you? And number three is practice, intentful practice. Even if it's just 5 minutes a day, sitting quietly, come to your practice with one question that you're curious about. When you begin, start with a yes or a no question, and then ask, hey, is coffee okay for me to keep drinking? And then wait, allow, and just feel what's happening. Is your body contracting or expanding? Are you hearing anything? Are you seeing anything? And to just be patient if you don't receive anything right away, and just keep up that practice, ideally daily, and you will be amazed, especially if you set the intention for your channeling ability to show itself to you in a very easeful and gentle way.
Beautifully said. Incredible work that you're doing. I could listen to you talk for about 4 more hours, and I know that you have to run because you're a busy and an important lady. But Dr. Helané Wahbeh, thank you so much for making time to speak with me today. It's been a real pleasure, and I can't wait to read more about your work. Your book is The Science of Channeling. And where can people learn more about you and your work?
If you go to our website at www.noetic.org, we have our publications page, our research page. You can participate in our research, get connected to the IONS community. We'd love to have you join us on this path of discovery.
Wonderful. Well, this has been another episode of Unpacking Possibility. Thank you so much for joining me today. And if you have enjoyed this episode, please make sure to like, follow, and comment and share. And until next time, be well.